A flight attendant scanned the first-class cabin, her gaze settling on two siblings sitting quietly in their seats. Something in her expression shifted, a hint of doubt, a touch of suspicion, before she briskly approached them. "You two need to leave here immediately." The young girl blinked, confused. "But these are our seats." The flight attendant's tone turned sharper. "I don't think so." Passengers around them turned to look, whispers spreading, and within minutes security was called. The siblings were forced off the plane, feeling humiliated, bewildered, and completely unaware of a crucial detail. Their father owned the airline. And when he found out, the flight attendant wouldn't just regret her mistake, she'd wish she'd never made it. Before we begin the story, comment below where you're watching from in the world today, and if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Let's get started. The airport buzzed with activity, passengers rushing towards their boarding gates, voices mingling with the constant announcements over the loudspeaker. Two siblings, Emily and Noah, stood near the boarding area, first-class tickets clutched in their hands. Emily, 17, checked her phone one last time, ensuring everything was in order. Noah, 12, stood beside her, bouncing excitedly, his backpack slung loosely over one shoulder. "How much longer until we board?" Noah asked, rocking back and forth on his heels. Emily glanced at the screen on the gate. "Soon," she said, slipping her phone into her pocket. Their father had booked them first-class tickets, a treat they weren't used to, and she could tell Noah was thrilled about the experience. When their group was called, they headed towards the gate, handing their boarding passes to the attendant, who barely glanced at them before waving them through. As soon as they stepped onto the plane, Noah's eyes widened. The first-class cabin was nothing like the cramped economy seats they were used to. The spaciousness, the plush seats, the quietness, it all felt surreal. "Wow," Noah whispered, his eyes darting around. Emily smiled, nudging him forward. "Come on, let's find our seats." They reached their row, carefully placing their bags in the overhead compartment before settling into their seats. Emily adjusted her seatbelt across her lap, while Noah reached for the window shade. Looking out, a few rows away, Miss Calloway, the flight attendant, moved down the aisle with a bright smile, greeting passengers and checking their seat numbers. She was tall, composed, her uniform perfectly pressed, her posture upright and authoritative. But when she reached Emily and Noah's row, her steps slowed, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, before she tilted her head slightly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but firm, "are you sure you're in the right seats?" Emily looked up, confused. "Yes, these are our seats." She pulled out the tickets and handed them to Miss Calloway. She took them, her eyes scanning the details, her expression unchanging, but her grip on the tickets tightened slightly before she returned them. "These are first class," she stated as if they didn't know. Emily nodded. "Yes, we know." Miss Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line. "Who booked these seats for you?" Emily took a deep breath, feeling Noah shift beside her. "Our father," she said calmly. Miss Calloway stood still for a moment as if considering something, then without another word, she turned and walked away. Noah leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Why did she ask that?" Emily sighed. "I don't know." A few minutes later, Miss Calloway returned, this time accompanied by Mr. Hensley, another flight attendant. He was older, with graying hair and a serious demeanor. He stopped in front of them, clearing his throat. "We need you both to step out of the first-class cabin for a moment," Mr. Hensley said, his tone neutral but firm. "We need to verify some information about your tickets." Emily felt her stomach tighten. "Verify what?" "We already showed them our tickets." "Just a quick check," he said, avoiding eye contact. "Please come with us." Noah's earlier excitement had vanished, his fingers gripping the armrest. "Why do we have to move?" he asked in a small voice. Miss Calloway crossed her arms. "We can do this the easy way, or we can call security." The way she said it, like a warning, like a threat, made Emily's chest tighten. She could feel the stares, the way passengers were starting to notice but remained silent. No one spoke a word in their defense. Emily tried to stay calm, grabbing their bags and urging Noah to follow. He hesitated but complied, head down as they walked down the aisle. Whispers echoed behind them, but not a single voice spoke up for them. As soon as they stepped off the plane, the door slammed shut behind them. A uniformed security officer stood nearby, watching them closely as if they were a problem to be dealt with. Emily pulled out her phone, her hands shaking as she scrolled to her father's number. Noah stood beside her, shoulders slumped, the earlier excitement completely gone. She pressed the call button. "Dad," she said as soon as he answered, her voice trembling, "they just kicked us off the plane." Silence. Then her father's slow, deliberate voice came through. Who did this? Emily turned her head slightly, watching Miss Calloway and Mr. Hensley board the plane, leaving them behind. Her jaw clenched. The flight crew, she said quietly. Another pause, but this time not of confusion or shock, but something else, something colder. Stay right there, her father said, his voice unreadable. Don't talk to anyone. I'll handle this. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what he would do, but she knew one thing for sure, this wasn't over, not even close. Emily lowered the phone from her ear, her fingers still gripping it tightly. She turned to Noah, who looked up at her with worried eyes, his shoulders slumped, his hands gripping his backpack straps. What's Dad going to do? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. Emily sighed slowly, shaking her head. I don't know, but I don't think they're ready for this. The airport terminal now had a different feel. The same place that just minutes ago had been filled with excitement, now felt cold, stale, and unwelcoming. Other passengers walked past them, their expressions neutral, unconcerned about the two siblings who had just been removed from their flight. A uniformed security officer stood near the gate, arms crossed, watching them as if they had done something wrong. Emily resisted the urge to glare at him. They hadn't caused any trouble, they hadn't been loud, they had simply sat in their assigned seats. And yet, here they were outside the plane while their first-class seats remained empty. Noah sighed and sat down in one of the chairs near the window, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his hoodie. Emily remained standing, her mind racing. Their father, Darius Holloway, was a patient man, but she knew him well enough to know that there were certain lines that couldn't be crossed, and this was one of them. A few minutes later, Emily's phone buzzed in her hand. It was a text from her father. Flight number, gate number. I need names. Emily quickly typed in the details, her heart pounding. She knew her father's calm voice didn't mean he wasn't angry. That means he's thinking, calculating. He's not the type to shout or threaten. He addresses problems precisely, and when he acts, everyone listens. She tucked her phone away and glanced back at Noah. Dad's handling it, she said. Noah nodded, but she could tell he wasn't convinced. Are we going to get back on the plane? Emily hesitated before answering. I don't know. Noah sighed again, kicking his feet lightly as he looked out at the planes on the runway. I don't like the way they looked at us, he mumbled, like we didn't belong. Emily's hands clenched into fists at her sides. He was right. Miss Calloway hadn't looked at them with suspicion because of their tickets. She looked at them as if they didn't belong, as if she had judged them the moment she saw them. A few minutes passed in silence, and just as Emily was about to check her phone again, the gate agent's voice crackled over the loudspeaker, calling for Miss Calloway. Miss Calloway, please report to the front desk immediately. Emily's eyes flicked toward the gate. Noah sat up straighter. What do you think it is? Emily didn't answer, but deep down she knew something was happening, and Miss Calloway had no idea what was about to hit her. Miss Calloway smoothed the front of her uniform as she approached the front desk, her usual composure still intact. She didn't like being summoned like this, especially over the loudspeaker where passengers could hear. It gave the impression that she had done something wrong, and she prided herself on maintaining control in every situation. When she reached the desk, Mr. Denton, the gate supervisor, was waiting for her, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his posture, stiff, professional but slightly uneasy, that made her straighten up. You needed me? She asked, keeping her voice light. Mr. Denton nodded but didn't speak immediately. He turned slightly, gesturing toward a side entrance where an airport official stood, phone pressed to his ear. The man glanced at Miss Calloway before speaking into the receiver. Yes, sir, she's here. Miss Calloway frowned slightly. Who is that? Mr. Denton sighed, lowering his voice. We just received a call from headquarters, direct orders from Darius Holloway. The name hit her like a bucket of ice water. She blinked. Excuse me? Mr. Denton's lips pressed into a thin line. Apparently, the two children you removed from first class, their father owns this airline. For the first time in years, Miss Calloway felt unsteady. Her hand tightened on her clipboard as she processed what he had just said. Darius Holloway, not some high-status frequent flyer, not a friend of some executive, but the owner of the airline. Her stomach churned. Mr. Denton continued, his voice cautious. Mr. Holloway is personally involved in this matter, and he wants an immediate explanation. Miss Calloway felt her heart pound faster. This wasn't just a passenger complaint, this was a career-threatening mistake. She swallowed, trying to maintain her composure. It was just a simple misunderstanding, she said quickly. I had reason to believe their seats were a mistake, so I followed protocol and asked them to step aside while we verified. Mr. Denton cut her off with a sharp look. Did you verify first, or did you jump to conclusions? The question hit her harder than she expected. Miss Calloway opened her mouth but couldn't find an immediate answer. Mr. Denton sighed, rubbing his forehead. They're still waiting in the terminal. Mr. Holloway's personal office just sent new orders. You will personally escort them back onto the plane, and you will issue an apology in front of the passengers. She gasped. What? You heard me, he said, his voice firm. Headquarters is watching this. The last thing this airline needs is a discrimination scandal. You're going to fix this. Miss Calloway swallowed hard. She had been in control of this situation just minutes ago, and now she was being reduced to cleaning up her own mess. She forced a tight smile. Of course I'll handle it. But as she turned toward the terminal, her mind was reeling. Passengers had watched her remove Emily and Noah from the plane, and now those same passengers were about to watch her bring them back. For the first time in her career, she wasn't the one in power, and she hated it. Emily sat stiffly in the waiting area, arms crossed, her phone resting on her lap. Noah fidgeted beside her, his sneakers tapping lightly on the floor. He had been quiet for the past few minutes, occasionally glancing toward the gate where passengers continued to board as if nothing had happened. She could still feel the lingering stares, the silent judgment. No one had spoken up when they were asked to leave, but now, as they sat outside the plane, people were starting to whisper. Her phone buzzed and she snatched it up immediately. Dad. Just stay put, they'll come back for you. Her eyebrows furrowed. Come back. Before she could type a response, the familiar click of heels made her stomach tighten. Miss Calloway appeared, walking towards them with a forced expression, her lips pressed tightly. Her usual confidence was still there, but now there was something else, something she was trying to hide. Noah sat up straight. She looks angry. Emily breathed slowly. She should be. Miss Calloway stopped in front of them, clearing her throat. Miss Holloway, Mr. Holloway, she said, her voice strained, there's been an oversight. Emily narrowed her eyes. An oversight? Miss Calloway's jaw clenched slightly. Yes, upon reviewing the seating chart, we've confirmed that your tickets were indeed correct. You may return to your first-class seats. Emily didn't move. She studied Miss Calloway's expression, noticed how her fingers were slightly curled in her palms, how her shoulders were a bit more tense than before. She wasn't apologetic, not even embarrassed, she was just angry at having to stand here and say these words. Noah glanced between the two, then leaned closer to his sister. Do we have to go back? Emily looked at him, her heart tightening at the unease in his voice, as if the excitement he had felt earlier had completely vanished. She turned back to Miss Calloway. We'll go back, but I want to hear you say it. Miss Calloway's expression twitched. Say what? You assumed we didn't belong. Emily's voice was calm, steady. I want to hear you admit it. The silence around them was heavy. Miss Calloway's fingers twitched slightly, but she tried to keep her face neutral. I misjudged the situation. That's not what I asked, Emily said. Miss Calloway took a deep breath, glancing over her shoulder at the gate desk where Mr. Denton stood with his arms crossed, watching her every move. She clenched her jaw before turning back to the siblings. I made an assumption, she said through gritted teeth, and I was wrong. Emily let the words hang in the air between them before finally standing up, grabbing her backpack. Noah followed, adjusting the strap on his shoulder as they walked back towards the plane, Miss Calloway leading the way through the gate. Noah glanced at Emily. She didn't mean it, he mumbled. Emily nodded slightly. I know, and that's what makes it worse. The walk back to the plane had a different feel. Emily and Noah were no longer the two passengers who had boarded earlier, excited and oblivious. Now, every step felt heavier, as if they were carrying the weight of what had just happened. Miss Calloway walked ahead of them, her posture stiff, the back of her uniform still perfectly pressed. She didn't look back at them, offering no acknowledgement beyond the forced apology she had been made to give. As they reached the jet bridge, Emily noticed the flight attendants near the entrance stiffen as they saw her and Noah returning. The tension in their shoulders, the shift in their expressions, made it clear they all knew exactly what had happened. Mr. Hensley stood by the door, hands clasped behind his back. His voice was flat as he spoke. Welcome back, Miss Holloway, Mr. Holloway. Your seats are ready. Noah hesitated slightly before stepping onto the plane, glancing at Emily for reassurance. She gave him a slight nod before following. As soon as they entered the first-class cabin, the atmosphere changed. Conversations quieted, heads turned. Some passengers quickly looked away, pretending to focus on their books or the in-flight screens. Others stared openly as if waiting to see what would happen next. Emily's eyes flicked to their empty seats. They were exactly as they had left them, untouched, waiting. Miss Calloway cleared her throat, stepping aside stiffly. "Please take your seats." Emily and Noah walked past her without another word. Emily settled back into her window seat, adjusting her backpack beside her. Noah sat down more hesitantly, his hands gripping the armrests. The silence was stifling, and then, unexpectedly, a voice broke through. "It's about time," an older man muttered from across the aisle. Emily turned her head slightly. The man in the tailored suit shifted in his seat, but didn't make eye contact. He wasn't talking to her, he was talking to Miss Calloway. She stiffened but didn't respond. Another voice, softer this time, a woman a few rows back. "They should never have been asked to leave in the first place." Miss Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time since they had boarded, Emily saw something flicker across the flight attendant's face, something that looked like embarrassment. She spun on her heel and walked towards the front of the cabin without another word. Noah let out a slow breath. "That was weird," he mumbled. Emily kept her gaze forward. "She's not in control anymore," she said simply, and for Miss Calloway, that was the worst part of all. Miss Calloway disappeared towards the front of the cabin, but Emily knew she wasn't far. The way she walked was too fast, the tension in her shoulders, it was clear she was trying to maintain her composure. This wasn't just about being forced to bring them back, it was about losing the control she had assumed was hers. Noah fidgeted beside her, adjusting his seatbelt. Though the plane hadn't moved, he still seemed uneasy, his fingers tapping on the armrest. "Are we really just going to sit here like nothing happened?" he mumbled. Emily didn't answer immediately. She could still feel the lingering stares, the weight of everyone's curiosity pressing down on them. The passengers who had ignored them when they were removed from the plane were now suddenly interested in their return. A flight attendant, Hannah, according to her name tag, approached cautiously. She was younger than Miss Calloway, her expression unreadable but not unkind. She hesitated before speaking. "Would you like something to drink before we take off?" she asked, her voice softer than the others. Noah didn't say anything, but Emily could feel his tension. She glanced at Hannah, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Did you ask everyone else that question when they first sat down?" Hannah's expression flickered, but she didn't look away. "No," she admitted, "I didn't." Emily let the silence hang between them before finally answering. "Water for both of us." Hannah nodded slightly and walked away. Noah turned to his sister, his voice almost a whisper. "Why did you ask that?" "Because she wants to make things right," Emily said simply, "but she didn't do anything when it mattered." Noah frowned, sinking further into his seat. He didn't even touch the in-flight screen in front of him, something he had been so excited about an hour ago. His excitement had been stolen, replaced with a quiet understanding that Emily hated to see on his face. She checked her phone, her father's last text still on the screen. "Just stay put, they'll come back for you." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but before she could type a response, the loudspeaker crackled to life. "Miss Calloway, please report to the cockpit immediately." Noah sat up straight again, Emily's grip on her phone tightening. She didn't know what was happening up front, but she had a feeling Miss Calloway's troubles were just beginning. Miss Calloway's heels clicked sharply on the floor as she walked towards the front of the plane. She could feel the weight of each step, her heart racing. The captain never called her to the cockpit unless it was something serious. She reached the door, took a slow breath and stepped inside. Captain Rowe, a man with years of experience and little patience for nonsense, sat in his seat, his expression unreadable. Beside him, the first officer kept his eyes on the controls, though the tension in the air suggested he was fully aware of what was happening. The in-flight phone sat on the center console, the call still active. Miss Calloway swallowed. "You called for me?" Captain Rowe didn't look up immediately. He pressed a button on the phone, switching it to speaker. A deep voice echoed in the small space, calm and controlled. "Miss Calloway, this is Darius Holloway." Her breath caught in her throat. There was no mistaking the name. Everyone in the airline knew who Darius Holloway was. His name carried more weight than any executive, more than the CEO. He was the owner, the man who had built the airline from the ground up, the man whose children she had just humiliated. Captain Rowe leaned back in his seat, folding his arms. "Mr. Holloway has some questions for you." The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Miss Calloway's palms were damp as she clasped them in front of her. "I, Darius Holloway." He cut her off. "Did you verify my children's tickets before asking them to move?" Her throat tightened. She hesitated. "I was following protocol." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Captain Rowe's jaw twitched, he was watching her, waiting. That's not what I asked. She swallowed, her mouth suddenly dry. No, sir. Another long pause. So you assumed they didn't belong in first class? The words weren't loud, weren't accusatory, but they carried a weight that made her legs feel weak. I misjudged the situation, she said quickly, trying to keep her voice steady. Darius Holloway let out a slow breath. And did you ask any other first-class passengers the same question? She felt her stomach drop. Her silence was answer enough. Captain Rowe shook his head slightly, his disappointment evident. Darius continued, his voice devoid of anger, just certainty. Miss Calloway, you will personally ensure that my children receive the service that every other first-class passenger receives. You will publicly apologize to them in front of the entire cabin, and when this flight lands, you will explain yourself to the executive board. Miss Calloway's hands trembled slightly. I understand. Good, Darius said, his tone final. The call ended with a soft click. Captain Rowe leaned forward, adjusting his headset. You heard the man, he said, making no attempt to hide the disapproval in his voice. Now go fix your mistake. Miss Calloway nodded stiffly, turned on her heel, and walked out of the cockpit. Her heart pounded as she walked back through the first-class cabin. Passengers were watching her now, some feigning disinterest, others openly curious. She reached Emily in Noah's row and stopped. Every part of her wanted to walk away to avoid this moment entirely, but she couldn't, not this time. I need to apologize, she said to both of them. Emily didn't look up immediately, she ran her finger along the edge of the armrest, her expression unreadable. Noah, however, was staring at her. I made an assumption, Miss Calloway continued, choosing her words carefully, and I was wrong. Silence. Noah shifted in his seat, glancing at Emily. Finally, Emily turned her head, looking directly into Miss Calloway's eyes. Are you sorry because you meant it, she asked softly, or because you got caught? Miss Calloway felt a lump form in her throat. She had spent years being in control, years setting the rules, and now for the first time she realized she had no power here. She swallowed, But she didn't have an answer, and Emily knew it. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Miss Calloway stood there, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had offered an apology, but Emily's question still hung in the air, unanswered. Noah shifted in his seat, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his hoodie. He glanced at his sister, waiting to see what she would say. The tension in the cabin was palpable. A few passengers tried to act as if they hadn't heard anything, but their occasional glances betrayed them. Emily tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. So then. Miss Calloway inhaled, trying to maintain her composure. I was wrong to ask you to leave, she said, carefully choosing her words. I should have verified your tickets before making any assumptions. That's not what I asked, Emily said, her voice soft but firm. Miss Calloway's fingers twitched slightly. She had always been the one in control, the one setting the tone in situations like this, but this was unlike anything she had dealt with before. She had dismissed these two children from their seats without a second thought, and now she was being forced to acknowledge it. Noah finally spoke up, his voice almost a whisper. Would you have done the same if we looked different? Miss Calloway's throat was dry. She didn't have an answer for that, at least not one she could say aloud. Emily watched her carefully, her sharp eyes catching the fleeting hesitation in Miss Calloway's expression. It was all the confirmation she needed. You can't even say it, Emily whispered, shaking her head slightly. Miss Calloway felt her stomach churn. She had spent years believing she was always right, that her decisions were unquestionable, but now, standing here under the weight of Emily's gaze, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, doubt. Her job required quick thinking, instincts. She had always trusted her ability to read people, to spot problems before they became real issues, but today she was wrong, and not just about the seats, she was wrong about them. Miss Calloway cleared her throat, glancing around the cabin as if hoping to find an escape, but there was none, not with the passengers watching, not with the weight of her mistake pressing down on her. I shouldn't have judged you, she said finally, her voice smaller now. I was wrong to assume you didn't belong. Noah blinked, looking up at his sister. Emily studied Miss Calloway's face, reading between the lines. The words had been spoken, but there was still something hesitant in them. Okay, Emily said simply. Miss Calloway frowned slightly. Okay. Emily nodded, leaning back in her seat. Yeah, you said what you needed to say. I don't need anything else from you. Miss Calloway's stomach dropped at the dismissal. She had expected anger, even braced herself for more confrontation, but this calm, withdrawn response was worse. It meant she had lost. Noah turned to Emily. You don't want her to say anything else? Emily breathed slowly, her fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. It's not about what she says now, it's about what she does next. Miss Calloway felt her throat tighten. Emily didn't want words, she wanted proof. The flight attendant hesitated for another moment before nodding stiffly. If you need anything during the flight, she said, her voice now lower, please let me know. Neither of them replied. Miss Calloway turned and walked away, her steps lacking their usual crispness as she disappeared down the aisle. Noah let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He leaned closer to his sister. Do you think she really meant it? Emily was silent for a moment. I don't know. Noah sighed. I still feel uncomfortable sitting here. Emily turned her head slightly, observing the passengers around them. Some were still glancing their way, while others quickly looked away when she made eye contact. The energy had shifted, but she wasn't sure if it was guilt or just awkwardness. She glanced out the window, watching the last of the bags being loaded onto the plane. Her phone buzzed in her lap. Dad, everything's been sorted out, Emily typed back. She apologized, not sure she really meant it, but yes, we're back in our seats. The dots appeared almost instantly, indicating he was typing. Good, stay put, this isn't over. Emily's stomach fluttered. She had a feeling he didn't mean it for her. Miss Calloway thought this was the worst of it, she was wrong. Miss Calloway walked quickly towards the galley, her mind reeling. She had apologized, done what was asked, but the unease in her chest hadn't dissipated. The feeling of control slipping through her fingers was foreign, unsettling. She had spent years in this role, commanding the cabin with authority, ensuring everything went exactly as expected, but today she had miscalculated. She reached for a glass, pouring herself some water with slightly trembling hands. The sound of footsteps behind her tensed her up. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Hannah, the younger flight attendant, leaned against the counter, watching her. Are you okay? Hannah asked, her tone cautiously neutral. Miss Calloway stiffened. I don't need your concern. Hannah raised an eyebrow. It doesn't look like they accepted your apology. Miss Calloway glared at her. That's none of your business. Hannah tilted her head slightly. Isn't it? She folded her arms. Look, I don't like getting involved in things like this, but I have to ask, did you check their tickets before pulling them out of their seats? Miss Calloway's fingers tightened around the glass. She didn't answer. Hannah scoffed, shaking her head. You didn't, did you? Miss Calloway faced her. I made a judgment based on? Hannah interrupted. Based on their appearance. The words cut like a knife. Miss Calloway opened her mouth but couldn't say anything. Hannah sighed, shaking her head. You know, you made them feel like they didn't belong. That boy Noah, he was so excited when he got on the plane, now he won't even lift his head from his seat. She let the words sink in before adding, that's on you. Miss Calloway swallowed, something uncomfortable twisting inside. Hannah sighed and pushed away from the counter. You might have patched things up for this flight, but this isn't over for you, you know that, right? Miss Calloway said nothing. Hannah gave her one last look before walking back into the cabin, leaving Miss Calloway standing there, gripping the edge of the counter. For the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if she would ever feel in control again. Back in the first-class cabin, Emily glanced at Noah, who had barely moved since Miss Calloway left, his fingers tapping absently on the armrest, his expression unreadable. Are you okay? She asked softly. Noah hesitated before shrugging. I don't know. Emily sighed, leaning her head back against the seat. Dad's handling it, she reminded him. Noah nodded slowly. Yeah, but will it change anything? Emily was about to answer when the loudspeaker crackled to life again. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are preparing for takeoff. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin. Noah sat up straighter as the plane began to taxi. Emily glanced around, noticing the energy in the first-class cabin was still different. Everyone had seen what happened. Some passengers seemed to pretend nothing had happened, but others were giving them quiet glances. The man in the suit across the aisle cleared his throat. Well, he muttered, his eyes straight ahead, that should never have happened. Emily turned her head slightly. But it did. The man looked uncomfortable, nodding stiffly before turning his attention back to the screen in front of him. Emily said nothing more. The plane lifted off the ground, but the weight in her chest remained. As they soared into the sky, she glanced at her phone. Another text from her father had arrived. We land in 3 hours, Dad. I'll be waiting at the gate. Emily's grip on her phone tightened. She didn't know exactly what her father had planned, but she was sure this wasn't the last conversation Miss Calloway would be forced to have today. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane leveled out in the sky, but the tension in the first-class cabin hadn't dissipated. Emily sat up straighter, her fingers absently tracing the edge of the armrest, her mind stuck in a loop of what had just happened. Noah barely touched the in-flight screen in front of him, which was unusual. Normally he would be excited to scroll through the movie list, but now he just sat there, staring out the window as the clouds passed by. She could still feel the weight of the silence around them. The passengers who had witnessed everything were pretending to be busy, but their stolen glances gave them away. It was funny, when she and Noah had been forced off the plane, no one had said a word, but now that they were back, it seemed everyone had an opinion, even if they were too afraid to voice it. A flight attendant appeared beside them, but not Miss Calloway. Hannah. "Would you like something to eat?" she asked gently, her eyes flicking to Noah before settling on Emily. "Or something to drink?" Noah shook his head without looking up. Emily hesitated, then breathed out. "Just water for him," she said. Hannah nodded and quickly moved away, returning a few minutes later with a glass of water, carefully placing it on the tray in front of Noah. He mumbled a small thank you but still didn't lift his head. Hannah lingered for a second, as if considering whether to say something more. Finally she spoke in a low voice. "I'm really sorry about what happened earlier." Emily raised an eyebrow, watching her carefully. "Are you saying that because you mean it?" she asked. "Or because you saw how it all played out?" Hannah didn't flinch. "Because I mean it." Emily nodded slowly. "Then why didn't you say anything earlier?" Hannah swallowed, shifting slightly. "Because I've seen things like this happen before, and I always told myself it wasn't my place to intervene." She looked down, sighing. "But that doesn't make it right." Emily didn't reply, she just watched Hannah for a moment before turning to Noah, who finally took a sip of his water. "You work with her, right?" Emily asked, glancing back at Hannah. Hannah nodded. "Yeah, she's been here longer than me. A lot of people don't question her decisions." "What about you?" Hannah hesitated before saying, "I used to be one of those people." "Not anymore." Emily tilted her head slightly. "Why?" Hannah breathed out slowly. "Because today I saw what it looked like from the other side." Emily leaned back in her seat, considering that. At least Hannah was being honest, which was more than she could say for Miss Calloway. Hannah straightened up. "If you need anything, just let me know." Emily gave a small nod. "Thanks." Hannah walked away, and for the first time since boarding the plane again, Noah finally turned to Emily. "Do you believe her?" he asked. Emily sighed. "I don't know, maybe." Noah pursed his lips. "At least she said something." "Yeah," Emily murmured, but she only said it when it was safe. Noah didn't answer, but the meaning of Emily's words hung between them. The flight continued, each minute passing heavily. Emily checked her phone, scrolling through messages from friends who had no idea what had just happened. Noah finally turned on a movie but didn't really watch it. Then suddenly an announcement came over the loudspeaker. "Miss Calloway, please report to the cockpit immediately." Emily's eyes snapped to the front of the cabin. Noah frowned again. Passengers exchanged glances, some shifting in their seats. Even Hannah, who was serving drinks a few rows back, paused mid-step. Emily crossed her arms. "I guess Dad's handling things." Noah blinked. "But we're still in the air." "Exactly." They watched as Miss Calloway walked stiffly towards the front, disappearing behind the curtain that led to the cockpit. As soon as she was gone, whispers spread through the first-class cabin. A few passengers leaned towards each other, murmuring. Others glanced towards Emily and Noah, but this time their curiosity was different. They weren't just staring at two kids who had been removed from their seats. They were now staring at two kids whose father had enough power to summon a flight attendant mid-flight. Noah turned to Emily, his eyes wide. "What do you think is happening up there?" Emily gave a slight smirk. "I think Miss Calloway just realized this is a lot bigger than she thought." And for the first time since they had boarded the plane, she felt the balance of power shift. Miss Calloway's breathing was heavier as she entered the cockpit, the door closing behind her with a soft click. The enclosed space suddenly felt much smaller than usual. Captain Rowe sat in his seat, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The first officer kept his focus on the instruments, though the stiffness in his posture suggested he was aware of the situation unfolding behind him. But it wasn't the captain's silence that made Miss Calloway's stomach churn. It was the voice coming from the speaker of the in-flight phone. "Miss Calloway." Darius Holloway's voice was calm, controlled, but there was a weight to it, an authority that made the air heavier. "I assume you now understand the extent of your miscalculation today." Miss Calloway tried to maintain her composure. Sir, He cut her off. I'm not interested in excuses. Her jaw clenched. Captain Rowe leaned forward, his eyes locked on her. Headquarters has been informed of what transpired. Mr. Holloway has requested an immediate review of your conduct upon landing. Miss Calloway felt the blood drain from her face. Review? Darius's voice came back. I own this airline, Miss Calloway, which means when a situation like this occurs, I have the right to ensure it's handled properly, and believe me, it will be handled. Miss Calloway gripped the edge of the nearest seat to steady herself. Sir, I admit my mistake, but Do you? Darius asked, because I have reports from passengers, your colleagues, and even the captain, suggesting you didn't think it was a mistake at all, until you were forced to rectify it. Captain Rowe watched the color leave her face. Miss Calloway, he said, his voice softer but firm, you didn't just embarrass 2 passengers, you embarrassed this airline. Miss Calloway felt her throat tighten. Darius let the silence stretch before continuing. You didn't question any other first-class passengers, you didn't stop anyone else to check their tickets, only my children. I wonder why. She knew exactly why, and worse, she knew he knew exactly why. Her fingers clenched into fists at her sides. I wasn't thinking. Darius's voice remained steady. No, you were thinking, just not correctly. Miss Calloway's hands were ice cold. Captain Rowe sighed, rubbing his temples. Mr. Holloway, what would you like us to do before landing? She will personally ensure my children receive the highest level of service for the remainder of this flight, Darius instructed. Not because I care about their comfort, they already know they belong in first class, but because I want the other passengers to see what it looks like when someone is forced to admit their mistake. Humiliation burned in Miss Calloway's chest. And upon landing? Captain Rowe asked. Darius's answer came without hesitation. Security will be waiting for her at the gate. She will be escorted directly to the executive offices, where she will explain herself to the board. If her explanation is unsatisfactory, she will no longer be employed by this airline. Miss Calloway's stomach churned. Sir, please? This conversation is over, Darius said. A click echoed through the cockpit as the call ended. Miss Calloway stood there, frozen. Captain Rowe sighed and turned to her. You should return to the cabin, he said. I suggest you make good use of your remaining time. Miss Calloway nodded stiffly, though her legs felt weak as she stepped out of the cockpit. She could already feel the weight of the passengers' stares waiting for her on the other side. For the first time in her career, she had no control over what would happen next. Back in the first-class cabin, Emily scrolled through her phone, her expression unreadable. Noah had finally chosen a movie to watch, but she could tell he wasn't really paying attention. Passengers whispered, their eyes darting towards the front of the plane, waiting to see what would happen next. And then Miss Calloway appeared. She walked slowly down the aisle, her expression carefully composed, but Emily could see it in her posture, the stiffness in her movements. This wasn't the woman who had stood before them earlier, demanding they move. This was a woman who had just realized that for the first time in a long time, perhaps ever, she was on the other side of the power dynamic. She reached their row and stopped. The silence stretched. Noah glanced up, shifting uncomfortably. Miss Calloway took a deep breath, then spoke. May I offer you something? A drink, a meal, anything? Her voice was strained, controlled. Noah looked up at Emily as if unsure how to respond. Emily studied Miss Calloway's face, the forced politeness in her expression. This wasn't sincerity, this wasn't an apology, this was survival. Emily leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms. You didn't ask us that when we first sat down. Miss Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line. I would like to rectify that now. Emily tilted her head slightly. Would you be doing this if my last name wasn't Holloway? Miss Calloway's face remained neutral, but Emily saw a flicker of shame in her eyes. No, Emily whispered, answering for her, you wouldn't. Noah sighed beside her, suddenly feeling exhausted. I'll just have some juice, he mumbled. Miss Calloway nodded stiffly. Immediately. She turned and disappeared towards the galley. Noah sighed, leaning back in his seat. This feels so weird, he said. Emily didn't take her eyes off the aisle. It's because she's not sorry, she's scared. Noah hesitated. Is that enough? Emily was silent for a moment, then shook her head. No, she said, but it's a start. As Miss Calloway returned with the drink, passengers watched her closely, some with quiet amusement, others with judgment. And Emily knew that in that moment, Miss Calloway felt every single one of those stares. For the first time, she was the one being scrutinized. For the first time, she was the one who didn't belong. Miss Calloway placed the juice on Noah's tray with precision, her fingers steady despite the storm raging inside her. She forced a tight smile and quickly turned away, wanting to put as much distance as possible between herself and the two siblings. She could still feel the weight of their gaze, Emily's calm, unreadable stare and Noah's hesitant confusion. It was an unfamiliar feeling. She was the one who set the rules, who dictated order in the cabin, and now she was the one waiting for judgment. As she moved down the aisle, she could feel it every whisper, every glance from the first-class passengers. Some were merely curious, others seemed smug as if enjoying the fact that she was now the one walking on eggshells. A few, she suspected, had probably done the same thing she had done earlier, silently judging the two children when they first sat down, assuming they didn't belong, and only now were they feeling guilty about it. She reached the galley, gripping the counter, her breath shallow. How had it come to this? One moment she was in control, running the cabin as she always did, the next she was being pulled into the cockpit and forced to answer to the most powerful man in the airline industry, a man whose children she had humiliated, a man who wasn't going to let this go. The reality of the situation sat in her chest like a stone. She wasn't just dealing with a passenger complaint, she was dealing with Darius Holloway, and now security would be waiting for her at the gate, the executive board would be waiting for her. She had never been in trouble before, not like this. Sure, there had been minor complaints over the years, passengers who thought she was too strict, too rigid, but nothing that had escalated beyond a simple written report. She had been untouchable, but not anymore. She closed her eyes, breathing slowly. Perhaps, just perhaps, if she played the rest of this flight perfectly, if she showed genuine remorse, the board might take pity on her. Maybe Darius Holloway wouldn't fire her. Her fingers twitched. Taking a steadying breath, she straightened her uniform, put on the most professional face she could muster, and walked back into the cabin. Passengers noticed her return, but she ignored them, forcing herself to focus. She needed to get through this flight without making things worse. She needed to be perfect. She moved silently through the first-class cabin, checking on passengers, refilling drinks, adjusting tray tables, and offering warm towels with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She hated this feeling, the uncertainty, the helplessness, and every time she glanced towards Emily in Noah's row, she could see it, the way Emily was watching her, studying her, as if waiting to see what she would do next. She knows, Miss Calloway thought bitterly, she knows I'm not really sorry, she knows I just don't want to lose my job. Miss Calloway swallowed and continued to move. Emily tapped her fingers lightly on the armrest, watching Miss Calloway move down the aisle with forced precision. Everything about her posture, her movements, screamed discomfort. She wasn't acting out of kindness, she was acting out of fear. Noah quietly sipped his juice beside her, his shoulders still slightly slumped. The excitement he had felt before the flight had never returned. The damage had been done. Emily glanced at the other passengers. Some had returned to their books and movies, pretending nothing had happened, but she caught the way a few still looked up as Miss Calloway passed, whispering to each other. She hadn't just lost control, Miss Calloway had lost their respect. Emily checked her phone, another text from her father. "We land in 2 hours, Dad. Security is ready, just stay put." She breathed slowly. 2 hours? She wondered if Miss Calloway realized what awaited her when they landed. Noah shifted in his seat. "I feel kind of bad for her," he mumbled. Emily turned her head slightly. "Why?" Noah hesitated. "I don't know, she looks nervous, like she knows she messed up." Emily watched him for a moment. Noah had always been softer than her, willing to see the good in people, even when they didn't deserve it. "That doesn't change what she did," she said softly. "I know," Noah admitted, "but what if she's really sorry?" Emily sighed. "Then she'll show it when no one's forcing her to." Noah nodded slowly, but she could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. Miss Calloway returned to their row one last time. "Would you like a blanket or a pillow?" she asked stiffly, the words robotic, rehearsed. Emily didn't answer immediately, she just looked at her, really looked at her. The woman standing before her wasn't the Miss Calloway who had ordered them off the plane with confidence and certainty. That woman had been sure of herself, sure of her power. This woman knew she had none left. "No," Emily said simply. Miss Calloway nodded, looking relieved to be dismissed. She turned and walked away without another word. Noah sighed. "I still feel bad." "You don't have to," Emily whispered. "She made her choices, she just doesn't like the consequences." Noah said nothing after that. Emily turned back to the window, watching the endless expanse of sky before them. In 2 hours they would land, and for Miss Calloway her real problems would just be beginning. The 2 hours in the air seemed to stretch longer than usual. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the approaching evening. Most of the passengers had settled into their seats, some engrossed in books, others watching movies or dozing off. The steady hum of the engines filled the air, but even in the quiet, the tension lingered. Emily watched the time tick by on the screen in front of her, the estimated arrival time constantly adjusting by a few minutes, but the final destination never changing. In less than 2 hours they would land, and in less than 2 hours, Miss Calloway would have to face the reality she had been trying to ignore for the entire flight. Noah had finally curled up in his seat, half asleep. She knew he wasn't really resting by the way his foot still tapped lightly on the floor, the way his fingers fidgeted with the sleeve of his hoodie. He wasn't comfortable, not really, and neither was she. Her father had told her to stay put, but Emily knew Darius Holloway well enough to know that whatever he had planned for Miss Calloway, it wouldn't be simple. Her father wasn't one for impulsive actions. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he acted in silence and let the consequences speak for themselves. And right now Miss Calloway had no idea what was waiting for her. Across the aisle, a soft voice broke the quiet. "I just wanted to say that I'm really sorry about what happened to you too." Emily turned her head. It was the older woman from earlier, the one who had spoken up after they were forced back onto the plane. She sat a few rows back, her reading glasses perched on her nose, her expression kind. Emily watched her carefully. "Why are you apologizing?" The woman hesitated, clasping her hands in her lap. "Because I was sitting right here when it happened," she admitted, "and I didn't say anything." Emily felt her chest tighten slightly. The woman sighed as if carefully considering her words in that moment. "I saw the way that flight attendant looked at you before she spoke. I saw the way she questioned you without questioning anyone else, and I knew it wasn't right," she said, "but I didn't speak up until your father intervened. And that made me uncomfortable." Emily let the words settle for a moment. She had expected apologies from Miss Calloway, from the company, even from other airline staff, but she hadn't expected this, an apology from someone who had stayed silent. "You were afraid," Emily said simply, "that's why you didn't say anything." The woman's face flushed slightly, but she nodded. "Yes." Emily tilted her head slightly. "Afraid of what?" The woman hesitated. "I don't know, causing a scene maybe, or getting involved in something I thought wasn't my business, or maybe," she sighed, shaking her head, "maybe I was afraid of what would happen if I acknowledged what was really happening." Emily watched her carefully. She wasn't like Miss Calloway. There was no forced apology here, no script written by the company to save face. This was genuine. Noah stirred beside her, rubbing his eyes as he sat up. "What's going on?" The woman turned to him with a small, kind smile. "I was just telling your sister that I should have spoken up sooner." Noah blinked sleepily, looking between them, then shrugged. "Well, you're saying something now." The woman smiled gently. "I suppose that's something too." Emily nodded slightly, her expression unreadable. "Yes." The woman looked relieved and returned to her book, leaving Emily to her thoughts as Noah shifted in his seat. Emily caught movement at the front of the cabin. Miss Calloway had reappeared, but she wasn't moving down the aisle with her usual confidence. She lingered near the curtain that separated the first-class cabin from the rest of the plane, hesitating for a fraction of a second before forcing herself to continue. Her eyes flicked towards the passengers but quickly looked away. It was almost as if she could feel their judgment, as if she knew her presence had shifted from respected authority to whispered disgrace. She had been tried in the court of public opinion and she had lost. Hannah, the younger flight attendant, passed her, heading towards Emily and Noah's row. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something almost understanding in her eyes as she approached. "I wanted to check on you," Hannah said softly, offering a small smile. "How are you feeling?" Noah shrugged. "Tired." Emily watched Hannah for a moment before answering. "Fine." Hannah nodded. "I know today hasn't gone as it should have." She hesitated, then glanced quickly towards the front of the plane, where Miss Calloway was pretending to rearrange the food cart. "I don't know what will happen to her when we land," Hannah admitted, lowering her voice, "but I know she's never been held accountable for anything before today." Emily tilted her head slightly. "And that bothers you?" Hannah sighed. "It's complicated." "No, it's not," Emily said simply. Hannah offered a small, knowing smile. "No, I guess not." She stepped back. "Let me know if you need anything before we land." As she walked away, Emily turned to Noah, who had been watching the conversation quietly. "Do you think she really means it?" he asked, his voice small. Emily considered the question for a moment. "Maybe," she said finally. Noah was silent for a moment before nodding. "Dad's going to fire her, isn't he?" Emily didn't answer immediately. She turned her eyes towards Ms. watching her move through the cabin with that forced grace. Her head was held high, even as everything around her was falling apart. "Yeah," Emily whispered, "I think so." And for the first time she wasn't sure if that was enough. Miss Calloway wasn't just losing her job, she was losing her reputation, the respect she had built over years, and that could be more damaging than anything. But that was the thing about actions, once they were done they couldn't be undone, and Miss Calloway was finally learning that lesson the hard way. The final hour of the flight dragged on, thick with a tension that never truly dissipated. Miss Calloway had retreated to the galley, avoiding unnecessary interactions, perhaps trying to salvage what little dignity she had left. Emily could feel the shift in the cabin, not just in how the passengers reacted but in how the crew behaved. No one spoke of what had happened, but it hung in the air like an immovable weight. Noah had finally started watching a movie, though Emily could tell he was still thinking about everything. His fingers tapped lightly on his knee, his mind working even as his eyes stayed glued to the screen. He always did that when something bothered him, silent but never stopping the churn of his thoughts. Emily checked her phone again, no new messages from her father. She didn't need them, she already knew what awaited them at the gate. Security, company executives, a reckoning. Miss Calloway thought she had experienced the worst of it. She thought the forced apology and the stares from the passengers were the full weight of her punishment. She had no idea. The captain's voice came over the loudspeaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into Los Angeles International Airport. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." Noah sat up straighter, stretching his arms. "Finally," Emily sighed, glancing towards the front of the cabin. Miss Calloway had emerged, her expression unreadable, her movements automatic as she prepared for landing. She distributed hot towels, adjusted passenger trays, went through the motions, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. For the first time in her career she was unsure of her future. When she reached Emily and Noah's row, she hesitated for a brief moment before speaking. "Please return your tray tables to their upright positions," she said, her voice hollow. Emily didn't move immediately. She studied Miss Calloway's face, searching for something, a sign of genuine remorse, something beyond the fear of losing her job. She found nothing. She returned her tray table to its upright position and settled back into her seat. Noah did the same, though he refused to meet Miss Calloway's eyes. Miss Calloway lingered for another second, then continued moving. The plane tilted slightly as it began its descent. Emily rested her head against the window, watching the city lights come into view. This was almost over, or perhaps for Miss Calloway it was just beginning. As soon as the wheels touched the ground, passengers rushed for their phones, eager to reconnect with the world outside the plane. Emily's phone buzzed almost instantly. "Dad, we're at the gate." A simple sentence, no unnecessary details, no reassurances, just a statement of fact. He was here. Emily turned to Noah. "Dad's waiting for us." Noah nodded but said nothing. He already knew what that meant. The plane taxied towards the gate, the usual procedure unfolding, seatbelts unbuckled, passengers shifting in their seats, the crew preparing for arrival, but there was an added layer of tension unrelated to turbulence or delays. Miss Calloway hadn't moved from her spot near the galley, her hands clasped in front of her, her posture unusually rigid. She was waiting, not for passengers, not for paperwork, she was waiting for her fate. Emily checked her phone again, another text from her father. "Dad, security is in place, executives have been notified." She breathed slowly, slipping her phone back into her pocket. Noah sat up straighter, stretching his arms as he prepared to leave. "Do you think she knows what's about to happen?" Emily glanced at Miss Calloway. "Oh, she knows," she whispered. The seatbelt light turned off, and passengers began to retrieve their luggage. The energy in the cabin was different now. Some rushed to leave, others deliberately waited, wanting to see what would happen next. Then came the moment of truth. The door opened, and a uniformed security officer stepped in, standing just beyond the jet bridge. He didn't block the way, didn't cause a scene, but his presence was enough to cause a stir. Passengers glanced between him and Miss Calloway, the whispers starting again. Miss Calloway's face was pale. She had assumed, hoped that she would be allowed to handle this quietly, that perhaps she could explain herself in private, but Darius Holloway didn't do things quietly. This wouldn't be a meeting in some back office. This would be a statement. As the first-class passengers began to gather their belongings, the security officer stepped forward. "Miss Calloway," he said, his voice polite but firm, "you need to come with us." Passengers froze. Miss Calloway took a deep breath, glancing around as if searching for an escape, but there was none. She was done. Hannah, the younger flight attendant, shifted uncomfortably, her expression torn between sympathy and the understanding that there was nothing she could do. Noah gripped the strap of his backpack. "Whoa," he whispered. Emily didn't look away. Miss Calloway's mouth opened slightly as if to protest, but no words came out. She was used to being the authority, she was used to having the power to dictate how things went, but not today. The passengers who once looked to her for guidance now watched her with judgment. The whispers that had followed Emily and Noah off the plane earlier now followed her. She was the one being watched, she was the one under scrutiny, and worst of all, she had brought it upon herself. Captain Rowe emerged from the cockpit, his expression sternly professional. He didn't acknowledge Miss Calloway directly, but he gave a nod to the security officer. "She's yours." That was it. That was the moment it became official. Miss Calloway had lost. The security officer gestured towards the jet bridge. "This way, ma'am." Emily watched Miss Calloway, the woman who had ordered them off the plane without hesitation, the woman who had walked through this cabin with such certainty, now take the slowest steps of her life. The whispers followed her, just as they had followed Emily and Noah earlier, except now no one looked away. She disappeared down the jet bridge, and just like that she was gone. The flight attendants pretended to carry on as normal, directing passengers towards the exit, but the energy had shifted. Noah let out a heavy breath. That was intense. Emily stood up, adjusting her bag. "Let's go." As they stepped off the plane, the terminal felt almost too bright, too loud, but none of that mattered because standing just ahead, waiting near the gate, with an unreadable expression was Darius Holloway. And as they walked towards him, Emily knew this wasn't over, not yet. Darius Holloway stood just beyond the gate, posture straight, hands clasped in front of him. He wasn't a man who needed to raise his voice or cause a scene to command attention. His presence alone was enough. As soon as Emily and Noah stepped off the jet bridge, his eyes softened, but only slightly. He slowly looked them up and down, scanning their faces as if ensuring they were unharmed. "Are you two all right?" he asked, his voice steady. Even Noah shifted beside Emily, nodding quickly. "Yeah, we're fine." Emily breathed out. "We're fine, Dad." Darius watched her for another beat before giving a curt nod, a temporary satisfaction. But there was something unreadable in his expression, something quiet but sharp, a calculation happening beneath the surface. He turned his head slightly, looking past them towards the jet bridge. Miss Calloway emerged, flanked by two company executives and the security officer who had escorted her off the plane. She looked smaller than before, her confidence stripped away, her uniform still crisp, but now feeling like an empty shield. Passengers leaving the plane gave her quick glances, their whispers continuing as they passed. A few even lingered nearby, pretending to check their phones just to witness whatever was about to unfold. Darius Holloway didn't move, didn't react as Miss Calloway was led towards him. She stopped a few feet away, her throat tight as she forced herself to meet his eyes. There was no mistaking the power dynamic now. Miss Calloway had spent years deciding who belonged and who didn't. Now she was the one being questioned. One of the executives, Mr. Langford, stepped forward. He was a senior member of the board, his neatly pressed suit a reminder of the company's upper management. He glanced between Darius and Miss Calloway before clearing his throat. "Mr. Holloway," he began, choosing his words carefully, "we're prepared to address this matter immediately." Darius didn't acknowledge him immediately. He kept his focus on Miss Calloway, watching the way she shifted her weight slightly, her fingers twitching at her sides. Finally he spoke. "You removed my children from their seats without checking their tickets." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Miss Calloway swallowed. I made an error in judgment," she said carefully. Darius tilted his head slightly. "An error in judgment?" She choked on her words. I didn't." "You humiliated them in front of the entire first-class cabin," Darius continued, his tone still calm, controlled. "You made an assumption not based on their behavior, not based on their manners, but based on—" A pregnant pause. Miss Calloway's lips parted slightly, but she had no answer. Darius let the silence stretch before turning to Mr. Langford. "I assume the airline will take immediate disciplinary action." Mr. Langford straightened up. "Yes, sir, Miss Calloway will be placed on administrative leave immediately. There will be an internal review and based on the findings." Darius held up a hand, silencing him. Miss Calloway flinched. "No review necessary," Darius said simply. The words were final. Miss Calloway gasped. "Mr. Holloway, please." Darius's expression remained unreadable. "You didn't hesitate when you ordered my children off the plane. You didn't stop to consider if you were making a mistake, You didn't doubt yourself as you humiliated them, you were certain, now so am I. The weight of his words pressed down on her like a crushing force. Mr. Langford nodded stiffly. Understood, sir. He turned to Miss Calloway. Effective immediately, your employment with the airline is terminated. Miss Calloway blinked rapidly. But. There was nothing left to say. Security stepped forward, waiting to escort her out. For the first time she was the one being dismissed. Darius shifted his attention back to Emily and Noah. Let's go, he said simply. Noah glanced back once, his eyes wide as he watched Miss Calloway being led away. Emily, however, didn't turn back. She didn't need to. The lesson had been learned. As they walked through the terminal, passengers still whispered, some glancing between them and the scene unfolding behind them. Noah tugged on Emily's sleeve. That's it? She just leaves? Emily nodded. She made her choices. Noah hesitated. Do you feel bad? Emily thought about it for a moment. Did she feel bad? Did she feel sorry for Miss Calloway, the woman who had assumed they didn't belong, the woman who had been forced to face her own judgment in front of an entire flight? She glanced at her father, his expression unreadable as he walked beside them, his presence commanding even in silence. Then she thought of Noah, how excited he had been when they first boarded the plane, how that excitement had been stolen from him when someone decided he didn't belong. She thought of the stares, the whispers, the silence from the passengers who had witnessed it all and said nothing. Finally she breathed out and looked ahead. No, she said, I don't. Noah nodded slowly as if understanding for the first time that justice wasn't always the same as kindness. As they exited the terminal, the air outside was cooler than she expected. The sky was darkening, the city bustling. Darius Holloway walked beside his children, his presence radiating an unspoken authority that filled the space with a palpable pressure. He said nothing, but Emily knew he was thinking, assessing. He wasn't a man of impulsive actions. He weighed everything carefully. Noah gripped Emily's hand, still trembling slightly. Emily squeezed his hand reassuringly. They walked in silence, their thoughts drifting in different directions. When they reached the parking area, a sleek black limousine waited. The driver opened the door and they stepped inside. The interior was spacious and comfortable, but Emily felt an invisible tension. Dad, Emily began, breaking the silence, was this necessary? Darius Holloway turned to his daughter, his eyes sharp. What do you think? Emily paused. I don't know, she said, I just feel uncomfortable. Uncomfortable because she was fired? Darius asked. Not exactly, Emily said, I just didn't like how it went down. Sometimes justice isn't pretty, Darius said, sometimes decisive actions are needed to protect the values we believe in. Emily nodded, she understood her father's point. She knew he only wanted to protect them, but something still felt wrong. I understand, she said, but I still think, maybe there were other ways to handle this. Darius Holloway looked at his daughter, knowing she was intelligent and sensitive. He was proud of her, but he also knew that sometimes hard decisions were necessary. Perhaps, he said, but sometimes there aren't many choices. They fell silent again as the limousine sped down the highway. Emily looked out the window, the city lights twinkling in the night. She wondered if Miss Calloway was seeing these lights, if she was thinking about what had happened. She didn't know, and perhaps she never would. But she knew that what had happened today would forever be a part of her memory. It was over, but it would never be forgotten.